Check. Test one, check. Colin, is the sound working for you?
Hello, welcome to McMillan Library and the kickoff of the Central Wisconsin Book Festival. Thanks for coming out tonight. I've got some sponsors to highlight here right at the get-go. Support for the 25 Central Wisconsin Book Festival was provided through the Marathon County Public Library, the Portage County Public Library, and the McMillan Memorial Library. The Community Arts Grant Program of the Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin, and the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation. Additional support was provided by the Merco Foundation, Reuter Ware Law Firm, Marathon County Public Library Foundation, Portage County Public Library Foundation, as well as Bound to Happen Books, Yankee Bookstore, Sojourn Booksellers, Red Eye Brewing Company, the Hmong American Center, Marathon County Historical Society, and the UW Center for Civic Engagement. And I just want to highlight that we also have a concert series here at McMillan tomorrow, September 26th, Lily Henley, and there's more concerts October and November, Medusa and Brian Drow. You can see those on our calendar. And outside on the table, as you're going out, we do have Central Wisconsin Book Festival stickers. Feel free to take one. And a little sheet, if you'd like. We'd love it if you provided some feedback for the festival so we can continue making it better. And now, while you're all here, I'll read a short intro to Michael Perry. He is a New York Times best-selling author, humorist, and volunteer firefighter from rural Wisconsin, known for his warm, funny, and deeply reflective stories of small-town life. Perry has written more than 20 books, including Population 485, Truck, A Love Story, and his recent novella, 40 Acres Deep. When he's not writing or performing, he still lends a hand with his local fire and rescue service and makes music with his band, The Longbeds. Please give a very warm welcome to Michael Perry.
Thanks. It's good to be back in Wisconsin Rapids, where I was born. I always look for the statue whenever I drive in, but my guy Tony out there, he manages our merch sales, and I told him on the way in, I said, this is where I was born, so keep an eye out for the statue, and nothing, so. Thanks a bunch for coming out. I'm just gonna shoot the breeze, tell some stories. I was trying to think back when the last time was I was here, and so I'm gonna try to stick to stuff that was published since then, but I'm gonna start out with the same story I always start out with, and some of you have probably heard me tell it before. It's just, no matter where I'm speaking in the state or sometimes even out of state, and no matter the makeup of the group or the venue, I just like to start with this story because it really, if you're not familiar with my work, as millions of people aren't, actually there's a whole bit I do about that too, which is, I'm not famous. I have a very weird career in that I'm well known within certain discrete circles, but it drops off pretty quickly. And so what I run into a lot, especially in this state, is people say, oh, are you Michael Perry, the author? And I'll say, yes. And they'll say, well, I haven't read your books. And that happens so often, and it's slightly awkward. So I had to come up with a response that would diffuse the situation, but do so lightly. And so now whenever someone says, well, I haven't read your books, I just say, that's okay. Millions of people haven't. And that worked great for several years until one year I did an event at a very high-toned university event in Illinois. And it was a university you'd all recognize if I said the name. And I was the writer of something. And they had an actual wine and cheese reception for me, which is half okay. I don't I don't drink, so I didn't have any of the wine, but I did show those Illinois people how to handle cheese. But anyways, this was back in the day when I had a buddy, Frank, and Frank was one of my great mentors. He was just a great editor. He was a friend. He would tell me the truth about my work, and he could be critical, but in the most helpful way. But he also was always broke, and so if I had a long drive, I'd always call Frank and go, "Hey, man, can you split the drive and you'll get, McDonald's in a hotel room." And so for the Illinois gig, he drove along with me. And so he was with me at this very high-toned wine and cheese reception. Frank's known me forever. He doesn't care if he hurts my feelings. And I get introduced to the chancellor of this university, a woman with many letters after her name. And they said, "Chancellor so-and-so, this is Michael Perry." And she said, "Oh, are you Michael Perry, the author?" And I said, "Well, yes." And she said, "Well, I haven't read your books." And I said, "Well, that's okay. Millions of people haven't." And ha, 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 I got a nice little chuckle. And then I felt a little shot to the ribs, and it was my friend Frank. And he leaned in, and he said, "Well, actually, Mike, it would be billions." So that was slightly unnecessary. But anyways, this little story I'm going to start with, as I said, many of you in the audience have probably heard me tell it. But it just gets me centered, and if you don't know anything about me and my work, it lets you know exactly where I'm coming from. So I simply wouldn't be here tonight or much of any place if it wasn't for a book called Population 485. And Population 485, it's just that old "Can You Go Home Again" book. It's been written many times by many people, many different ways. In my case, I wrote about going back to my hometown of New Auburn, Wisconsin, population 485. And I'd been away for 12 years, and I just wanted to find a way back into the community and to be some useful part of the fabric of the community. The trouble is I'm very much a loner. I'm not a joiner. I prefer to just sit in my room all alone. And when I moved back to New Auburn, I didn't belong to any of the local churches. I don't drink, so I didn't go to any of the taverns. I don't play softball. I don't bowl. And I can't polka. So there really was not much left. But the one thing that was left was the fire department. So I joined the local volunteer fire and ambulance service. I work with a lot of folks on the coast, New York mostly, but lately a lot of folks in LA as well. And I'm still on the local volunteer fire department. I make just a handful of calls a year, but they just need anyone they can get. And so these folks in Manhattan or in LA will find out I'm a volunteer firefighter, and they say, "Oh, you must be very brave and noble." And I always go, not especially. And then I explained to them that where I'm from, I got the two things they're looking for in a volunteer firefighter: a pulse and a valid driver's license. Plus, I'm home a lot during the day. And also, when I moved back to New Auburn, my two brothers and my mom were already on the fire department. So it was just a matter of it's what you did. It's like joining the JCs or something. So I'd been away for 12 years. I moved back. I joined the fire department. That book now has been out over 20 years, and I still to this day get emails, Facebook comments from people saying, "We read your book about life in the small town, and we loved it. We loved it so much that we've sold everything, and we're moving to a small town." And I always go, "Well, hang on there, Spanky. Because small towns can be difficult places. They got long memories. You can be 50 years old trying to live down something that happened when you was 15 in the gravel pit." And even I was going back of my own free will. I wound up having 12 of the most meaningful years of my life back in New Auburn. But I had a certain amount of trepidation, and that trepidation sprang from the fact that I was not the same guy when I went back to New Auburn as I was when I left. And what I like to say is that when I left New Auburn, I was a farm boy, a good student, and a fair defensive end. I returned 12 years later, a long-haired writer with soft hands and a nursing degree. So there's a certain amount of street cred to recover with some of my buddies in the coon hunting crowd. Now, I've since had to update the anecdote, specifically as it pertains to the long hair. For years, I had long hair, waist length. There's two reasons I no longer have long hair, and the first, sadly, is just generalized crop failure. Just got to the point where there was no point. And then the other reason is that it had started to get really thin on top, but was still real long and back. And I remember looking in the mirror one day and thinking, you really ought to cut it off. You're headed for the Ben Franklin look. But I hadn't made the move yet, and then we got paged out to fight a grass fire on the railroad tracks south of town. I was right up in the teeth of the flames, knocking it down, fighting from the black, as any well-trained wildland firefighter will tell you that you must. But I was right up in there, and all of a sudden one of the other firefighters ran up and started patting me. Now, normally, you don't get a lot of that. So I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Man, your hair's on fire." And indeed, it was crackling right along. So at that point, I thought, if it ain't falling out, it's bursting into flames. I'm just going to cut it all off. So the other thing I had to do, of course, in moving back was to overcome all of the stereotypes about male nurses, and I've heard them all. So the deal with me is I grew up on born here in Wisconsin Rapids, but at the age of 2, my mom and dad bought a farm in northwestern Wisconsin. So I grew up on a little dairy farm, milking cows, baling hay, working in the fields. In the winter we logged, so I grew up hauling logs and slinging slabs. And then at the age of 16, I started working summers on a ranch in Wyoming, a regular working beef and hay ranch. I rode roundup, did branding, and worked on the hay crew. So what I do from the age of 16 for the next 5 years, every summer I worked on the ranch in Wyoming, and I would work on the ranch all summer, and then I would bring my wages home, and I would apply them toward my tuition. I am here to tell you that I was the only cowboy in all of Wyoming who was putting himself through nursing school. And I based this on several conversations I had around the old Brandon fire. I was what they call a header, which meant we'd get up in the morning, we'd saddle up, we'd round up cattle, we'd spend most of the morning, in the foothills and down in the valleys and gathering all these cattle, and then we'd bunch them up in these remote branding corrals. And so then my job, once they were bunched up, was as I was a header, which meant the cowboys they'd rope a calf, they'd bring it in to the branding fire. I'd meet the horse, grab the rope, slide down the rope till I came in contact with the calf, throw the calf, wrestle it, as they called it, and then hold it while it was branded and vaccinated and whatever it is they did. So I'd be down there in the mud and the blood and the dirt and the dust and the whatever else, holding that calf that I'd wrestled. And some crusty old cowboy would walk up behind me with a red-hot branding iron, and he'd say, "Where are you from, son?" "Wisconsin." "What do you do?" "I'm going to college." "What for?" "I want to be a nurse." And it'd get really quiet out there on the prairie. I will never forget the night I told my dad I wanted to be a nurse. I wasn't too concerned. My father is a very gentle man, a reflective, introspective farmer, hard-working guy. But nonetheless, you're a 17-year-old guy. You're the leading tackler on the new Auburn Trojans football team. And you decide, tonight's the night I'm going to tell Dad I want to be a nurse. It's a moment. So we was walking to the barn after supper to milk the cows. I was about 5 paces behind him. And I said, "Dad, I want to be a nurse." And he stopped and he turned and he looked at me and he said, "Well, your mother is a nurse. It's a noble profession. I think you'll make a fine nurse." And he turned and started to walk to the barn. Then he stopped and turned back. He said, "There is just one thing." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "I just want to be there when they pin that little white cap on you." So I get back to New Auburn. I'm just trying to decide, is this going to work? Am I going to find my place back in this community? And so the story that I tell in the book, Population 485, is that the biggest event of the year in New Auburn is Jamboree Days. And Jamboree Days consist basically of a 5-minute parade and a softball tournament. And the proceeds from the softball tournament go to support the local park. So as members of the volunteer fire department, we're expected to pitch in and help run the softball tournament fundraiser. Now, in addition to the softball tournament fundraiser, directly adjacent to the softball field is a beer tent. We run the beer tent as well, and I ain't gonna lie to you, that is where most of the fundraising happens. Now, over the years, this softball tournament, has become very popular. And New Auburn at this time has only one softball field and no lights on that softball field. So in order to get all the teams through the brackets, they got to start playing softball at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning. They play all day long until dark. They resume play at 8 a.m. on Sunday morning and play all day long until the tournament has been resolved. So shortly after I moved back, still trying to decide if I've made the right move, I get assigned the duty by the chief of the fire department. I get assigned the duty of going down to the park on Sunday morning of Jamboree Days to clean up the beer tent, get it ready for the day. Now the chief sends me down there with a guy I've known ever since I was a tot. He's still a friend of mine. He's older than I am, but a guy that he'd been on the fire department longer than anybody except the chief. The chief sends me down there with this guy we call Bob the One-Eyed Beagle. Now, Bob the One-Eyed Beagle gets his nickname from the fact that he is severely cross-eyed. And when I say severely, that one eye is not just a little bit off. It's shot. If he's looking due south with his good eye, that other eye is looking due west. And now there's always a point when I'm telling this story, and we've hit it now, where in certain settings, a certain tension comes over the room. And I've even had people come up to me afterward and say, you know, it's very insensitive how you describe your friend's eye as being crossed. And all I can ever say to them is, he's aware. Like he's checked it out in the mirror and everything from both angles. Plus, he's one of these guys, and you all know your version of this guy. That eye is the least of his problems. This is a guy, he's got one eye, one kidney, and 2 ex-wives, both of whom work at the only gas station in town. So he's got to run 9 miles south to Bloomer every morning for gas, coffee, and chew, because they ain't serving him at the home place. So don't worry about the Beagle's feelings. So anyways, me and the Beagle, we get down to the park. It's 8:30 a.m. on Sunday morning. We're in the beer tent picking up paper plates and plastic cups and napkins. First softball game of the day is already underway. We're cleaning up the beer tent. This guy wanders in off the street, not a softball player, just a civilian. And he says, "Could I get a beer?" And I said, well, it is 8:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, but Beagle, you've been on the department longer. You make the command decision. And the Beagle says, well, I guess there's no law against it. And so he goes around behind our little makeshift bar there, and he draws the guy a beer, and he sets it down. The guy hands his money over, and he raises that beer to his lips, and he's just about to take a pull at the foam when he hears the crack of the bat on the softball field adjacent, and he freezes. Then he looks. Then he brings his lips back in line with the beer, which has not moved, and says, "A little early in the morning for softball." And it is at that point that I said, yes, I am back among my people. So about, I guess it's probably 11, 12 years ago now, I started writing a column for the Wisconsin State Journal called Roughneck Grace. And I wrote that column for 9.5 years. If I have time later, I'll tell you a little story about that. But 9.5 years, so I had a pretty good collection of these columns. And so since I was here last, we've published, I think, 3 or 4 collections of those columns. And I'm just gonna the one collection is called Million Billion, and I just want to read the introduction and then one piece. And I want to read it just because I'm a freelance writer. So whatever I'm doing, whether it's a novel, whether it's a memoir, whether it's a novella, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, whether it's an essay, whether it's a voiceover, whether it's a script, none of it happens if I don't sit down all alone and write. So I do think I'm still a writer, but I've always been uncomfortable with that phrase because of my background and how I was raised. And so I just, in the intro to this collection, Million Billion, I tried to explain. I've always tried to be a writer with a small W, which is to say I work at it never assuming the world is clamoring for my wisdom. Writing a weekly column is a good antidote to creeping pretensions of that sort. You constantly have to ask yourself if you're saying anything new, if you're repeating yourself, or if this week, maybe instead of your musings on the meaning of life, folks would rather hear how neighbor Denny caught the litter bugs. The schedule also doesn't allow for a lot of lingering revision. You just got to get it done and get it in. That's been good for me too. It's like writing as calisthenics as opposed to artful indulgence. This is the first piece in the book, called Aunt Mabel. The funerals having lately come one after the other, I had sworn an obituary moratorium, but when Great Aunt Mabel died last week, I knew I'd have to note it. I can't do justice to her 90 years other than to say, boy, she didn't waste any of them. Born up north there in the township of Madge near Sorona, she commuted to a one-room schoolhouse on wooden skis made by her father. When her school teacher ordered instruments from the Sears and Roebuck catalog, Mabel and her 3 brothers formed a family band, and a love of music would be central to her life until the end. In fact, she met her husband Robert at a square dance in the Sorona Town Hall, and they danced until Farmer's lung took him from the dance floor in the 1970s, and for good in 1982. As a teenager, she spent summers thinning rutabagas and picking potato bugs in the same fields as German prisoners of war. She also helped on the home farm, where her chores included egg collection, a task she dreaded for all the pecking she endured. By way of revenge, for the rest of her life, every time she ate at a restaurant, she ordered chicken. My memories of Aunt Mabel are divided between my childhood, when she would fry up the fish we brought her, and the last decade or so, when she began showing up at my public performances with a septuagenarian/octogenarian posse, a scene I had in mind when I described her in Truck, a Love Story. Aunt Mabel, 80 years old and currently charging off to every cultural event within a 50-mile radius of Spooner, Wisconsin, usually with a carload of restless contemporaries. They were something to see, this permed squad rolling up in a minivan with Mabel at the wheel, ready to encourage me during and razz me after. It was lovely to be made to feel like a kid at the school recital again in the very best way. Right through her final decade, she really was up for anything. When my brother asked if she wanted a ride in his 2-seater airplane, he hadn't even finished the question before she was headed for the cockpit, walking cast notwithstanding. Same when my brother-in-law offered her a ride in his ATV. Same when someone offered her a ride on a snowmobile. I share this so that when I tell you one of her dearest hobbies was sewing hot pads, you don't think she was just quietly whiling her time away. It started with a few made as tokens of thanks for helpful friends. Then she began donating them for fundraisers, Christmas food baskets, and assisted living facilities. The week before she died, she finished hand sewing the border on her 8,000th pad. There was a stack of the final batch at the back of the church, and after the service, we were invited to help ourselves. Over time, Mabel's reputation grew so that people brought her all kinds of fabric prints, from calico to comic. I chose a pair decorated with fire helmets for my firefighter pal Mills, John Deere logos for my collector neighbor Tom, And for my daughters, based on their favorites, one with cats and one with cowboy boots. This is just the thinnest gloss on a long, layered life, and a gloss over the stretches that weren't so blithe. But given this space, it'll have to do. Words are not the true memorial, nor the headstone, but rather the casserole cooling on the quilted fabric, Aunt Mabel's stitches neat and holding fast. I did another collection of these columns called Hunker, and I'm going to read two of them now. Let's see. One that's silly and one that's heartfelt. I'll do the silly one first. So, a little background on this one here. I mentioned I've been doing some work with folks in LA. So I've had books optioned for TV and film, and it sounds really cool to say that. It means nothing. You basically get a modest little check, and then no one ever talks to you again. But then a couple of years ago, I got an actual development deal. I signed a development deal, sold a pilot script, and signed a development deal. And my neighbor Denny down the hill there, he's like, "Oh, what's a development deal?" I said, "Well, I don't really know, but I've got one." And then it too disappeared in a sort of a brown mist. I'm really lucky. I have a great agent in New York City, and I remember the very first time one of my books got optioned by someone in Hollywood, and I was talking to her, I was like how I was going to spend all the opulence, and she just said, when it comes to Hollywood, I'll tell you when to get excited. That was 20 plus years ago. She still has never, ever called. And the other thing I really got going for me is everything in my life has happened pretty much 10 years after I hoped it would, and at about 40% of what I dreamed it would, which really sets you up well for working in Hollywood. Because, that development deal, maybe I'll write about it someday, but oh my gosh, it turned into a complete and utter, I can't use the phrase. But every time something awful happened, I said to my wife, they told me this is how these things go. So anyway, I think when I wrote this piece, I was headed out to LA or had either just been out there. Yeah, right before. I wrote this right before going to the meeting where I was going to pitch the show that I actually did eventually sell. First thing I did this morning was dive into a spruce tree while trying to catch a chicken. What I would tell you is, don't do that. It's a deceptive tree, the spruce. Its boughs drape downward in a graceful sweep. The word boughs itself, with the GH dissipating into thin air, conjures softness and breeze. One imagines plunging in only to be lowered gently to the ground as if in the arms of mother. Turns out there's lumber in there. Lumber of a sharp sort. I emerged with a red scrape traversing my pate from fore to aft. I knew better, of course. Boughs notwithstanding, it is, after all, a pine tree, needles, branches, bark, etc. But have you ever stepped out into the golden morn with your day all carefully planned and then wound up having to chase a chicken around and around in the dew, gnats, and humidity? By the time she ducked beneath that spruce, I had worked myself into an antisocial and anaerobic state, which may have clouded my thinking. It was one of those situations where you're grateful there were no witnesses. But then my first thought, as I felt the sting of sweat seeping into my scored scalp, was, I'm going to have to explain this all week long. I rarely mourn my departed hair. By the time it began falling out, I had other priorities. But there are two instances in which I dearly miss it. One is when I'm seated beneath an air conditioning vent. The other is when I pull a doofus move like head-butting a conifer. You fully follicled folk can tattoo the score of cats on your scalp and no one will be the wiser. But let me forget to duck for the furnace or craniate an open cupboard door, and the whole world reads the story on my dome. I first realized this back in the freshly bald days when I gouged my head on a protruding roofing nail in my garage. Later that week, 2 different people asked how I hurt myself. I was baffled until they pointed at my head, and I realized my clumsiness was inscribed for all to see. I have a series of meetings this week, relatively important meetings, not involving state secrets or cryptocurrency regulation or modeling contracts, but meetings in which I hope to convey some minimal competence, and in at least a couple of cases, convey that competence to someone I've not met before. I should probably explain the head wound right up front, provide context. Although here, just a few hours out, I'm puzzling over exactly how one frames the phrase, "I ran into a tree while chasing a chicken," in such a way that it instills trust, confidence, and investment. There is some irony in the fact that one of the meetings is related to intellectual property. It is possible the parties across the table will look at my head and doubt I possess any. So I don't know if it was probably true way back the last time I was here, but I wrote a book quite a while back called The Scavengers. And that was a 2-book contract. So in other words, I signed a deal to write the sequel before I even wrote the first one. And boy, everybody's still waiting. But I also signed a contract to write a book about fathers and daughters. And I got started on that book and had made some pretty good progress, and then had to just give it a pause out of respect to one of my daughters. So that book, I'm back to working on it now. I hope I've quit even hinting when it might be out, but I would like to finish it. But this piece right here is for a piece I wrote for my younger daughter, and I think the only thing you need to know is there's a reference in here to K-pop, and I'm an older dad. As a matter of fact, the last time when my elder daughter was a senior in high school, I was at the volleyball game cheering for her, and the woman next to me just said, "It's so lovely of you to come out here and support your granddaughter." But even as an older father, my younger daughter was very much into K-pop, which is Korean pop music. And it is distinguished by, it's pop music, it's fine, I enjoy it, but it also involves many very intricate dances, and the young ones learn these dances by heart, and my daughter learned many of them. So that's the reference. And I have a little office over our garage where there's woods behind me, and the back 40 is out my window, and then I can see parts of our yard. Last night when I stepped out of the little room over the garage and locked up for the night, I heard the sounds of some small creature meeting its end in the forest behind me. There was squealing and then suddenly none. It was unsettling and wholly natural. Both of our cats were in the house and are therefore absolved. More likely the predator was a coyote or a fisher or an owl. We have lots of owls. Unsettlement has been a recurring theme across a wide swath of public and private life lately. This is not all bad. Off and on this year, I've been reading Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book, Anti-Fragility, and based on my lightweight understanding, living through unsettled times prepares us to live through unsettled times. So wow, I guess we've all been getting a lot of practice running in a circle on the same rug. There is some relation between anti-fragility and hormesis, in which a small amount of a toxin or stressor strengthens us against the same. A lot of your anti-fragile hormesis fanatics lift weights for just this reason. I myself have dabbled. My back felt stronger, but my unsettlement was not cured. I will get some bigger bricks. If you're the critter who became dinner out there in the snowy woods, you are uninterested in my thoughts on hormesis. If this past year has kicked the slats out of your family, your job, your heart, you don't need some typist rattling on about fragility. I thought of that when I typed the words, "This is not all bad." Among the chief reveals over the course of the recent past has been light regard for the fragile among us. With that deference in place, I continue to study up on anti-fragility, in part to validate my own amateur theories, and in part to see if I can glean anything that will make me more a help and less a load for myself and others. By way of asterisk, let me say study up translates to read 5 pages and get some sleep. It's usually late by the time I crack the book, which is as thick as the print is small. And Talib sometimes writes as if he thinks I'm smarter than I am. Go figure. Early this winter, I went to fetch firewood and found myself stalled between the house and the barn, studying a series of oddly repetitive patterns in the snow. On closer examination, they proved to be composed of small boot prints, many of which were interconnected by arcing sweeps and swoops traced through the flakes. Then I remembered. Earlier that day, I looked out my window in the little room over the garage to see my daughter twirling through the yard, reenacting the intricate dances of her beloved K-pop. I want to be anti-fragile. I also wish to never discount the beauty of fragility as it relates to the ephemeral and how it might lift our hearts, in this case, through the remnant choreography of a child dancing in the great wide open. I think I might have read from this the last time I was here, so I'll just briefly mention this one, and I do a little chicken-themed reading. I wrote a book called Montaigne in Barn Boots, which was about the French philosopher Montaigne, and some say he invented the essay, and there are academics who have built entire careers parsing just one of his essays, whereas I was reading him on my iPhone in my deer stand, and I thought, well, definitely the world needs to hear from me on Montaigne. So I wrote this book, Montaigne in Barn Boots, and truly it is about Montaigne, but it's also just about that. Probably the toughest chapter in here for me. Not by tough, I don't mean it was any grand struggle, but that was just hard to get right and to try to convey what I was really feeling. There's a chapter called Roughneck Intersectionality. Just the idea that, you can enjoy literature and poetry and art and beauty, and you can also still go to the dirt track stock car races on Saturday night. It's all right. And so part of me was just trying to, it's called Montaigne in Barn Boots because an amateur rambles through philosophy, because I was just trying to somehow say, we don't got to divide up over these things. Clearly, I changed everything. But anyways, one of the things I loved about Montaigne is that he's very forgetful, and he made me feel so much better about myself. So this is just a quick little excerpt from that chapter, a chapter called Confound the Fool. This morning when I fed the chickens, I noted their water was drawn low and so set to replenish it by opening the valve on our rainwater reservoir. This homemade system collects runoff from the granary roof and is rigged together with reclaimed and repurposed items from the secondhand rain gutters to the industrial poly tank that used to contain I know not what, but has so far not caused tumorous drumsticks or glowing yolks. Due to the scavenged design of the system, combined with the fact that it is completely gravity-powered, I always feel environmentally pious when the water gurgles out the hose. The feeling evaporates, goes up in steam and curses, in fact, 30 minutes later when I leap from my desk upon realizing that I never closed the valve. Sprinting across the yard, I arrived to find the tank drained. Specifics of the subsequent soliloquies shall remain a secret between me and the feathered critters, all ruffled up and clucking at my outburst like church ladies who just caught the pastor peeing in the punch. Here is the exponent to my anger, the thing that speed ratchets me past crestfallen and straight to incandescent, the item that truly launches my rage rocket. In that bucolic moment when I was topping off the feeders and reflecting upon the earth-loving gurgle, I made a mental note to myself. Don't forget to shut it off. I tell myself this because I am forever forgetting to shut it off. And then, in the 6 seconds it took me to return the feed pail to the bin, my mind wandered, my feet followed, and I went tripping la-di-da back to the writing room, leaving the tank to exsanguinate. 300 artisanally curated gallons, currently percolating down valley where the neighbors will run it through their sump pump. And I did the exact same thing last week. Grandma always said I was a tad drifty, and I've been proving her right all my life. There was that time in college I pulled the front wheels off my Plymouth Duster to work on the brakes, and Mom called me to lunch just as I was finishing, after which I proved you can make it through 2 stop signs, 3 right-hand turns, over 5 miles, and up to 56 miles an hour before the left front wheel pops off because the lug nuts are back there in a pile on the shop floor. More recently, I wrote 482 words of a column eulogizing my old manual typewriter before nagging deja vu drove me to scroll up and discover I had already written that exact column 3 weeks previously, landing me right in the middle of a Montaigne quote in which he said, "I fear the treachery of my memory, lest by inadvertence it should make me write the same thing twice." In Montaigne's time, memory and intelligence were seen as one, and the phrase, "he has no memory," meant he is stupid. When I complain that my memory is defective, people either correct me or disbelieve me, Montaigne said, as though I were accusing myself of being daft. And in this case, I feel he is referring to every person who ever says, "We just talked about this. We went over this yesterday." Or, "Why don't you just write yourself a reminder?" Trouble is, many of these failures occur within time frames and situations in which writing one's self a note is impractical. In the category of driving off with things on my car roof, I count 1 wallet, circled back and found it in the Culver's drive-thru, celebrated my good fortune with a 2nd order of curds. 1 iPhone, heard it thump the luggage rack, then watched in the rearview mirror as it pinwheeled down the highway, and an infinity of coffees, each of which I placed on the roof just for a second, only to forget it in 2. The term absent-minded conjures up images of a lovable fuzzy head. My wife, Annalisa, can set you straight. It is a grind to live with someone who asks the same questions over and over, who goes out to sort the recycling and winds up at the library, who can't abide an extraneous apostrophe but dreams blithely past the screen door that has leaned against the siding for weeks. Apart from the frustration, Annalisa is 10 years younger than I, and I worry sometimes that she's just biding her time, gathering the evidence necessary to place me under professional supervision. One day when I was loading book boxes and music gear into my van and running late as usual, I kept reminding myself not to forget the cash box, then took off and made it 40 yards up the driveway before I realized I forgot the cash box. Slammed her into park, ran back for the cash box, jumped into the car and shot out the driveway, only to find my way blocked by the van I'd left idling less than 60 seconds previous. I snuck a peek at the kitchen window. Annalisa was watching and possibly taking notes. Buddy, I thought, one of these days she's going to make the call. So I have I can do an hour of just what it's like to deal with folks from New York City and LA. But I am actually working on an essay right now that I don't know if it'll ever see the light of day, but where I'm trying to hit that balance between having fun with folks, but also we dismiss each other way too easily these days. And so I also, of course, I love them. They've changed my life. I get to do things I never anticipated doing. My publishers, and they've just given a kid who grew up cleaning calf pens in rural Wisconsin a life that he never anticipated. And even the stuff in LA is very frustrating. They have, by the way, recently discovered the Midwest. And they want you to write about it, but then, and I was born in Wisconsin Rapids, lived in Nakusa, grew up on a farm in Wisconsin. I've been a Wisconsin resident all my life, and I literally had someone from LA say that if I did write something for them to please avoid coastal commentary. I was like, I just about drove through the gates of Universal Studios with my snowplow. They want us, but I don't think they're ready to deal with us. But anyway, it's actually much lighter than that, and I very much enjoy it. But occasionally, there's just stuff that isn't going to work with them. And I did a little novella called 40 Acres Deep, and it started out, this was several winters ago, one of the winters where we just had snow that didn't stop, just kept coming and coming. And on our old farm there, we have 2 big pole barns, and the snow just kept stacking up and stacking up. And I've seen barns collapse before, and it got to the point where I was concerned that our barn was going to collapse. And the problem is the pitch is so flat, and the shed is so large. There's just no way. You can't clear it with a shovel. You can't. I tried a lot of different things. None of it worked. And the only thing that works is to take 2 torpedo heaters and just start burning kerosene. And but I've got 2 of these sheds, so I would have to burn for a while here and then go to the next, going back and forth. And it was about 4 a.m, and I was out refueling and moving, and I was pulling a torpedo heater through the snow, and it tipped over, and I fell over, and there's kerosene leaking, and I was sweating and angry, and I was cussing. And then it just hit me. It was like, you're a goofball writer with 2 pole barns full of mostly crap. What if your livelihood was in that shed? And that was the seed that led to what became this novella about this farmer trying desperately to save his farm. And I wrote it and then sent it to my agent in New York. And as you've already discerned, she's very forthright with me. And sent it around to a few New York publishers, and there was no interest. And I don't present that as a complaint. I understand. They just don't know what to do. First of all, a novella, which longer than a short story, shorter than a novel. And then a very, very unrelentingly dark story about a farmer desperately trying to hang on to his farm. So we self-published it. That's how I got started, and just did it ourselves. And this thing has sold thousands of copies, and it's in like its 4th or 5th printing. And I don't say that to brag. That, believe me, if I had done this book with HarperCollins, it would have sold a lot more. But it's just an example that some stories just need to be crafted on your own and presented in your own way, and the audience finds them. You don't find the audience. So I'm just going to read a couple of excerpts from this. So I'll just dive in. Harold had come to consider the accumulating weight of snow on the farmhouse roof as his life's unfinished business. Daily the load grew on his heart, his head, the creaking eaves. There had been no blizzard. The flakes had fallen through stillness and hush, inch after inch, then foot after foot. With no wind to whip or drift it, the snow simply settled, forming marshmallow abstractions of whatever lay beneath. He thumbed a peephole in the window frost. Every pine tree was capped, every outbuilding banked. The bulldozer beside the machine shed looked as if it were coiffed in meringue. Only the oaks broke the motif, their bare branches arrayed as fossilized veins against the sky. She died a month ago, and he hadn't plowed the driveway since. In the old days, someone would have showed up by now, noticed the lack of tracks, waded through the drifts to knock on the door, waited just long enough not to be nosy, checked in just soon enough to be neighborly. The old days. He had come to despise the phrase. 3 words like hard candy gone rancid on the tongue, the taste of futile yearning, a cold soup of curdled memories, a toothless wine. As a child, he loved listening as the old-timer shot dice around the coffee pot down at Peterson's implement. 30 years later, after all the farm bankruptcies finally pulled Peterson's under, the new generation of oldsters stood in a sad huddle at the auction, nursing convenience store cappuccinos and shaking their heads at things these days. Harold bid $5 for a set of old wrenches, paid at the cashier's trailer, and on the drive home swore he wouldn't die trying to claw the past into the present. So Harold, he's a dairy farmer. Then he had a barn fire, and he couldn't rebuild after the fire, and so he went to crop farming, and then he couldn't make a go of that, and then now he's at the point where he has leased his farm to a bigger farmer. The farmer who leased Harold's cropland never showed up to farm it. In his stead came hired hand agronomists with wands and laptops and satellite-guided monster machines, doing in a day what had taken Harold weeks. No wasted moves, everything programmed and precise, as opposed to all his years spent grubbing around. One 15-below morning back when he was still milking cows, the worm gear on the manure spreader fractured. He had to hustle off to the parts store because the cow poop was solidifying by the second, and if he didn't get it unloaded, he'd have a half-ton shitsicle on wheels. His rust-bomb pickup truck wouldn't start until he crawled underneath and whacked the solenoid with a hammer. Halfway out the driveway, leaning in tight to the dash, eyeballing the road through a nickel-sized defroster porthole, he switched on the radio just in time to hear an evangelical finance guru declare, "Don't try to outwork stupid." And right out loud, Harold said, "Well, that's really all I got going for me." Side jobs, that's what it came down to. Digging koi ponds for orthopedic surgeons into country living. His wife stocking shelves at the dollar store, both of them hoping the lease money would cover the medical bills and the beef cattle would cover the taxes. Most every original local around here was stuck patching the gaps. Heck, at this point, even meth head was a side job. He'd grown weary of perfection and precision. He longed for worn leather, polished handles. What glacial marvels time and a calloused palm could work against an axe haft. Sometimes when another yoga-panted woman was griping down at him from her Denali over how much he undercharged for digging her prairie restoration patch, he faded into memories of Leon, the old 3-fingered grader driver, and how all the kids in the schoolyard ran to the fence and waved as Leon passed, his stub-digit hands dancing across the levers, putting a crown on the gravel so the rain wouldn't puddle. The grader man, they called him, a capital letter honorific and a fact. A good blade man, they'd say, back when even your laziest tavern rat understood the weight those words carried. The good old days, Harold thought, and then, true to his recent resolution, immediately snuffed the reminiscence. So I was nervous about this book a little bit because, I'm friends with little farmers, and I'm friends with some of them big lease farmers. And then even more specifically, the land adjacent to mine on our little farm there is owned by an orthopedic surgeon. And the topper is my wife teaches yoga. So when the lease farmer finally showed, it wasn't with a check, it was to renegotiate terms. "We're in this together," said the lease farmer. "The hell we are," said Harold. "Look, you really don't have a choice." The lease farmer's chest swelled a little as he spoke the words. His four-wheel drive pickup idled in the background. Harold had seen television ads for that vehicle and knew it to be equivalent in value to your entry-level Mercedes. Heated cup holders, and even more shamefully, it did the backing up for you. Raised and lowered its own tailgate, which also had a cup holder. "The choice," Harold answered, "is I'm going to step inside the porch there and then step out with a shotgun, at which point I will find you either waving a check or gone." "Oh, that's no way to..." It felt good to leave the lease farmer standing there. Even better to step back out with the shotgun and see the dust from that fancy truck hanging in the air. All his life, nose to the grindstone, quietly playing by the rules, tortoise to the hair while the brash and brassy crowd bullied on through. It felt good to put one of them on the run, to take a shortcut, to expedite the situation. But that lease money, that was a stall from which he suspected he would not recover. So that's it. I'm going to read one more paragraph, and like I said, it's a fairly heavy book. There's some humor in there. The last section that I'm going to read is, so I already started out by saying I think of myself as a small W writer. Nobody's waiting around for me to change the world. I'm not capable of it. But every once in a while, despite all that self-deprecation and humility, I survey the American literary scene. And I say to myself, this critical element is being neglected. And as I survey the American literary scene, I realize that no one, not even the cool kids, is getting 4 or 5 reviews in the New York Times or the London Review of Books. They are all failing completely to address the topic of torpedo heaters. And so I have just one little paragraph in here. And honestly, my favorite thing about this is not so much the torpedo heater, but the reaction of Harold, because it's the people I grew up with. So Harold is setting the torpedo heaters, trying to melt the snow off his shed. "It was a fundamentally glorious thing, a torpedo heater. Loud and basic and atmospherically transformative. It even sounded hot. A blow dryer scaled up to set the curls on a woolly mammoth. He could never really explain why items of this nature gave him such pleasure. His raising, he supposed. It was why he loved old pickup trucks, a good knife, a bolt-action rifle. Layered into the pleasure of their simplicity was the way in which they counterbalanced his philosophical predilections, his susceptibility to fuzzy-headed mawkishness. The fact that he took joy from pushing dirt with a bulldozer ensured he'd never get completely lost in the clouds. There was a decal pasted on the side of the heater. It featured a single declaration, bracketed in red exclamation marks. Never leave your torpedo heater unattended. Huh, said Harold, and headed for the house. All right, keeping a little eye on the clock here. I got a couple more things in mind. Briefly here, I have a book coming out, another one of those little tiny books. I was out and I did some gigs, as we call them, some humor gigs down in Alabama last winter. They went great. Everybody shares the same sense of humor. We just got a different accent. I told the one-eyed beagle story, went over huge down there. And I did, one of the shows was at a big barbecue, and then the other one was, it was at a great big roadhouse on the, what do they call that? The Floribama, the Floribama line there. I was right in the heart of it, folks. And, but the guy who brought me down there is a wonderful guy who's been very kind to me over the years. We're very, very different in so many respects, but he's a, kind of a motivational business speaker, and he's just been so kind to me. But one of the things he offered to do for me is take me out fishing in the ocean, and I've never gone fishing in the ocean. So I did the gigs, and then we got in his boat and went out in 12 miles out into the middle of the ocean. And I caught my very first fish in the ocean, and as I was reeling it in, the engine gave out on the boat. And we spent the next 4 hours getting back to shore. We were never in any danger, but it just took forever. The cool thing was he and I had 4 hours to talk, and we just talked and talked. And we talked about the people who had influenced us and the people that we didn't realize were influencing us at the time. And by the time we got to shore, he said, "You should put together a talk about this." So I put together a talk about it and then realized it would make a tiny little book. And so the book is coming out sometime next month. But tonight we went ahead and brought some copies, and we're going to secretly sell them because I'm the publisher. And by the way, the ones tonight, they're collector's items because we printed the wrong ISBN on them. So congratulations. Anyway, I'll just, the book is called Improbable Mentors and Happy Tangents: How Firefighters and Poets, Truckers and Nurses, Soldiers and Singers, and Other Improbable Individuals Show You the Way in Business and Creativity. I'll just read a couple of quick little sections. One is called Take Off on a Tangent. I once wrote that we spring from a thicket of tangents. As proof, a decade after I typed that line, a woman approached me backstage at a music festival and hiked up her sleeve. There, tattooed into her arm, was that very phrase. I've had about 5 or 6 people tattoo my writing into their arm or elsewhere, and that's up to them. That particular line, I worked really hard on that line, but I had one time I was working on a music festival, and it was 4 a.m, and we were printing posters, and someone came to me and said, "We got to print this poster, we're running out of time. Can you come up with something about a river?" And I went, "Oh yes, the river moves with the wind." I don't remember what I wrote, but I wrote it in under 60 seconds, and it went on a poster. They sold it at the music festival, and the year after that, this young woman came up to me and said that line was so amazing. And it's like, and I didn't have the heart to tell her. I was just really overtired. So many storylines make sense only when traced in reverse. In 1989, the editor of a local magazine asked me to write a piece about a band from northern Wisconsin. Having never heard of them, I assumed they played taverns and polkas. Turned out they had just signed a major country music recording deal. I interviewed them, submitted the story, and thought nothing more of it. Time passed, and the entertainment reporter of our local newspaper received a call from the national editor of Country Weekly, asking if the reporter was available to cover a nearby country music festival. Already swamped with writing up every cultural event in the Chippewa Valley, from the community theater production of Cinderella to the high school Christmas concert, the reporter declined. "Do you know of anyone else in the area who writes about country music?" asked the Country Weekly editor. "Yes," said the local reporter, having seen the only piece I had ever written on the subject. Next thing I knew, my phone rang. It was the Country Weekly editor calling from Nashville. "Are you the guy who writes about country music?" "Yes, I am." The assignment that followed, a simple 300-word report, led to decades of writing about country music, music and musicians in general, and the business side of music. I accompanied bands on tours in big shiny buses, scribbled notes backstage and in recording studios, and observed countless concerts from the wings. I profiled famous artists and non-famous artists, but also the bus drivers and truckers hauling the shows down the road. I interviewed studio hands and guitar techs, roadies and managers, and anyone connected with the process. For a good decade, culminating in my interviewing country superstar Tim McGraw for a Men's Health magazine cover story as he ate kale salad in a makeup chair, roughly half of my income could be traced back through a thicket of tangents sprung from that one time I thought I was going to write up a one-off on a polka band. Oh, thanks. My most famous improbable mentor ever was Oprah Winfrey, who taught me an everlasting lesson by proxy. This was back in the era of her monstrously successful daily television show. If you were a writer and you could get booked on the Oprah Winfrey Show, it changed your life. I was a writer, or trying to be one. Oprah asked me to be on her show. I said no. Late one night in the early 1990s, I was driving through the northern Wisconsin darkness when my headlights illuminated a body sprawled on the road. I pulled to a stop, hit the flashers, grabbed my rescue kit, and ran to the body. It was a man, bloody and unconscious, breathing raggedly. I cleared his airway, applied oxygen, and stopped the bleeding as best I could. It was a long time before the ambulance arrived and took him away. A few miles up the road, I stopped at a small gas station to wash my hands. I'd been wearing rubber gloves, but one of them had torn and there was blood on my finger. I scrubbed it with soap and water and went on my way. The next day, a sheriff's deputy tracked me down. The man had died. "Any chance you got blood on you?" the deputy asked. "I did," I said, at which point the deputy informed me that the man was HIV positive. At that time, any mention of AIDS often triggered jokes, condemnation, or fear, or a combination of all three. Facing a year of testing and hoping to dispel some of the mythology and admitting I was scared, I wrote an essay about my experience from the viewpoint of a rural EMT. The essay was published in Newsweek. This was a big deal for me. I'd never written for a publication anywhere near that size. The week it came out, I got a call from one of Oprah's producers. "Oprah loves your essay," gushed the producer. "She wants you to come on the show and talk about it." My heart ticked up a few beats. Me on the Oprah show. This could be my ticket. I'd be going nationwide. Oprah could shine a bright light on this important issue. On a less idealistic level, I also knew how many people in New York City publishing world watched Oprah, hoping to discover the next great book idea. How could they resist me? "We're doing a show about heroes," the producer said. I felt the sand hit my gears. My excitement dropped a notch. I wanted so badly to say yes. I was a struggling, self-published writer, hungry for any break I might catch. This was the biggest of the big leagues. "But it's not a piece about heroism," I said. "It's a piece about AIDS, not just being a big city thing, about trying to educate myself about it. And I'm nervous, not brave." "Well, we think you're a hero." I just did what I was supposed to do. Even as I said it, I knew it was a cliche, but I meant it. Same as if the person didn't have AIDS, and I didn't even know he was infected until after the fact. I'm happy to come on the show, but I wouldn't be comfortable coming on the show and being called a hero. And then there I was in my little apartment, holding a phone with no one on the other end. Oprah's was an efficient crew. I figure by the time I placed the headset back in that cradle, that producer had drawn a line through my name and was already dialing the next available hero. It's okay. No. That's just the beginning of that chapter, and then I go on to say that I wasn't. Let's set aside for a moment all the self-deprecating hoo-ha. I wasn't ready. It would have not been any help to me to be on that show. As a matter of fact, it would have been too soon, and I'm glad things unfolded the way they did. I'm going to close with two things. One is just an anecdote, and then the last will just be a very brief essay. before I do that, so that I don't forget, I just want to say thanks. Like I said, born here, lived in Nakusa we lived in a little house, and I don't remember it because I was too young when we left, but I love the fact that it was a log cabin originally, but it had that tar paper that looked like bricks. Some of you remember that? Yeah. So I love that because depending on what kind of image I want to portray or convey, I can always say, well, I was raised in a log cabin or a tar paper shack. But anyway, I planned none of this. Things continue to go well. I've got a couple of books under contract with publishers. I'm also self-publishing, do a lot of speaking. Just was out in LA. It's so fun. I got nothing on the line, so I'm pretty relaxed. Those folks out there are really high-strung. I'm pretty relaxed about it. If something good happens, great. If it doesn't, we're fine. But I'm just so grateful. The fact that you folks there's a million other things you could be doing tonight, and I do not take it for granted. And I don't know how to say it without making it sound cliched, but I truly don't. And my guy Tony's with me tonight. He's a friend of mine forever. And I remember the last time I was here, it was all I could do I was hauling all my own books and everything in, and it's just continued to slowly grow. And now Tony comes along with me. He's my merchandise manager. And I just can't do it all myself anymore. It's still just me and him in a 2002 Toyota van. I mean, and the back hatch didn't open today, by the way. So it's easy to say, to stay grounded, but I'm just so grateful. And so thanks for coming out tonight. When I'm done with the anecdote and with the essay, I'll hang out there as long as you like. Of course, I have books for sale, including that early release one with the wrong ISBN, but all the right words. But also, I'm just happy to say hi if you want. I do have, I am self-employed, and I do have one daughter still in college. Matter of fact, I had to pry her out of the van. She didn't have her own car. But anyway, I'm just so grateful. Thanks a lot. If you want to know more, I have a website, sneezingcow.com. If you go there, we have an online store. We have, that's where you can find out about our vast multimedia platform. The one thing I do ask is very specifically, and I should wait till later because you'll forget by the time, but if you're not on my mailing list, there's a very basic mailing list sign up. If we can have just your name, your email, and your zip code. Yes, we have a Facebook, and you can follow me there. We have Instagram, you can follow me there. But your stuff disappears. There's algorithms. I'm not being conspiratorial. It's how it works. And so if you allow us just to have your email, your name, and your zip code, we can let you know when a new book comes out, even when that one comes out with the correct ISBN. But we can also let you know if I'm coming to your area, because we'll do a little circle around the zip code. So if you don't mind, if you're tech savvy, we've got one of those QR code things you can do it. Otherwise, there's just plain old paper and pen. So thanks so much for coming. I wrote that column called Roughneck Grace for the Wisconsin State Journal for 9.5 years. 51 weeks a year I had to do a column. A couple of years I did all 52 weeks. That column has to be turned in at noon on Wednesday. It's a hard deadline. You can't move it. It's not adjustable. You miss it once, maybe, I had an emergency column in reserve. You miss it twice and maybe they fire you. Now, it ain't logging, right? But still, 51 to 52 columns a year due every Wednesday for 9.5 years. They don't just flow out of you. And I remember about 5 or 6 years in, someone asked me, they said, well, is it hard to keep coming up with ideas for these columns? And I said, well, yeah. I mean, have you read them lately? And so then they would say, well, how do you keep coming up with ideas? And I said, well, a lot of times I just wait for one of my brothers to call. And everyone gets a nice chuckle, but it's actually true. And so the story I'm going to tell before closing with the Roughneck Grace column is an example of a time when my brother absolutely saved my bacon and gave me a column. So I was at my desk. It was Wednesday. I had 2 hours to go till the hard deadline. I got nothing but false starts. I'm getting the cold, prickly failure sweats. My phone rings. It's my brother John. Now, my brother John is a bearded, backwoods-looking fella, and matter of fact, lives in a tiny little log cabin he built himself. I've written about this in the book, I believe, Truck. When I say it's a tiny log cabin, I'm not speaking figuratively. If you step through the front door, immediately to your left is a homemade wooden table. If you then proceed in a clockwise manner around the complex, it's homemade wooden table, stove, sink, refrigerator, hot water heater, washer, dryer, wood stove, chest of drawers, bathtub. There's a little rug in the middle of the room. You can stand on that rug and pretty much run everything. He sleeps in a little loft up in the purlins there. You will notice from my description, he has running water and electricity. However, the bathroom is located in a separate structure about 40 yards back in the brush. Tiny little building with a peak roof and a crescent moon cut in the door because he's a classicist. So the other thing, and I'm trying to push through a little quicker than usual tonight because of the time and respect to you. He had been a bachelor well into his 30s. As far as we knew, had never even been on a date. The one thing I should tell you also, his only vehicle is a dump truck. He's one of these jack of all trade guys, right? He's got the dump truck, the equipment trailer, skid steer, backhoe, log skidder, bulldozer. He's got his own sawmill. He's a sawyer. He reloads all his own ammo. He's a better shot than I am. He wanted to be a pilot, so he got his pilot's license. Then he wanted airplanes, so he bought an old airplane. He tore that down, put it back together. Then he had a pilot's license and an airplane, so he wanted an airport. So he took his bulldozer and he made an airport. Whereas I am a really fast typer. So it's a little rough for me at Thanksgiving. But anyways, he's just one of those guys. And so he's the guy, if you want a culvert put in or your basement backfilled, you call him. He shows up in his dump truck with his gear and does that. But also, if you invite him over for drinks and hors d'oeuvres, he shows up in his dump truck. So here he is, living in this tiny little log cabin with no indoor toilet, and his only vehicle is a dump truck. And somehow he has failed to hook up on the local dating scene. And then one day out of the blue, my mom calls and she says, "We think your brother has a girlfriend." And I said, "Well, how can this be?" Because to me, this is like waking up one morning and finding a fifth face on Mount Rushmore. And my mom says, "Well, as it turns out, she owns her own dump truck." Now, the longer version of this story is in the book Truck, but the highlights are, my brothers and I have one other brother, we are your classic stoic Scandinavians. I don't want to talk about my feelings, and you can't make me. I accidentally wound up being a memoirist who has to talk about his feelings, but in general, we just stay out of each other's business. If there's trouble, and unfortunately we have had more than one opportunity to prove this, we are like a rock. We come together. But in the interim, you do your thing, I'll do mine, we don't bother each other. And so this woman with the dump truck, again, I'm really shorthanding it, but they start dating. And I don't ask, none of my business. She seems like a lovely woman. Beautiful dump truck. Big, shiny red Mac. Finer than any piece of trash he's ever run. But anyway, it's none of my business. I don't ask. But one day, I have to borrow a logging chain. So I drive out to where my brother lives. I walk up this little trail through the jack pines to his cabin. I find him down on all fours pouring footings for a tiny little addition. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Putting in a bathroom." And I thought, oh, ho. But none of my business. But of course, so I just hang out. Well, a couple months later, they announced they are engaged to be married. It turns out she has agreed She's agreed to marry him. She's agreed to move into this tiny little cabin. She's agreed to sleep up in the purlins. But she insists that before they get married, he must install an indoor toilet. Now, as the brother who had been in many relationships up to that point, all of them complete train wrecks, I took him aside and I said, well, you see, this is how it starts. First, she wants an indoor toilet. Where does it end? But anyways, they got married on a Saturday morning. She basically said, you got to have the toilet in before the wedding. They get married at 10 a.m. on Saturday morning. He finishes installing the toilet at 4 p.m. on Friday. He picks up the phone, which is right next to the toilet, because so is everything. And he calls her basically to say, the toilet is in, the wedding is on. He gets her voicemail. As only my brother can, he goes, yeah, I got a message for you. So now you got that picture in your mind pretty firmly of who he is. So there I am. I'm at my desk. I got nothing but false starts, and my brother is calling, and he's calling to tell me that he was working in his shop, and he was using his bench grinder. Now, most people in this room would know, but a bench grinder, 2 stones, he rotated at a very high rate of speed. One of the stones exploded, and a hunk of it flew off and punched a hole deep into his neck. Just missed his carotid artery. So we were quite literally 1/8 of an inch from a memorial service to a really excellent story. Because if you was raised like I was, nothing's funnier than somebody getting hurt. If your buddy gets hit in the head with a monkey wrench and you've established that he's still breathing and he's probably going to be able to walk again, well, then nothing's funnier than your buddy getting hit in the head with a monkey wrench. That's just how I was raised. My other brother, Jed, he's a logger, and he's logging one time way up north of Highway 8. Some of you would know where that is. Very isolated area. Thank goodness on that day he had his helper Al with him. And my brother had felled this big tree, and he was walking up the trunk, limbing it. He got to the top, he turns around, he walks back. When he gets to the end, he steps off into the snow, and it was one of those winters with a lot of snow, and he misjudged the depth of the snow, and he kind of over-rotated when he stepped off, and there was a little sapling there that had been cut off at an angle, and he drove that sapling through his neck and out through the back of his mouth. And, of course, the blood just came pouring out, and as he said, yeah, I figured that was it. And so he jams his hand against it, trying to stop the bleeding. And he said his helper, Al, was there. He said, Al's going, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And my brother says, well, start the truck. So Al hauls him down Highway 8 to Rice Lake, Wisconsin. They take him to the hospital there. They can't handle him there. They put him in a chopper. They fly him to Eau Claire, down to Mayo, to the trauma center. Well, oddly enough, once they get him there, they find out there's not a lot they can do. The bleeding has stopped. He's managed to miss the serious stuff. And you don't even suture a wound like that. It just creates a pocket for infection. So there wasn't much to do, but because of the nature of the wound, they put him in the ICU overnight for observation in case he would throw a clot or hemorrhage. His family, his wife and little children were up north, so I was much closer to the hospital. So I spent the night in the ICU with him in that chair, next to the bed. Now, my brother's a tough nut. He's a tiny little guy. He's one of those wiry little guys you see in a small town, and your first thought is bar fight. So he doesn't need my help, but nonetheless, he's still my little brother. And I would wake up in the night and I would see him there in the half light of the ICU, and I'd feel a little pang of tenderness. I hope he's going to be all right, and he's my little brother. Morning comes. The very first person to visit is one of our knuckle-headed cousins, who stops at the end of the bed looking at my brother, who has suffered this horrific injury. And my cousin says, well, you're going to be able to stay underwater forever now that you got a gill. It's just the mindset. And I was raised with that. We had this neighbor, Jerry. When my folks moved from Nakusa, Wisconsin to New Auburn and bought that farm, my dad was a city kid. And instead of making fun of him, a couple of the neighbors took him under their wing. And one of them was a guy named Jerry. He was an Eastern European immigrant. He was the walking definition of the word stolid. There was nothing silly about him. He would work you into the dirt. He was very serious. He was very kind. There was nothing mean about him, but he just worked in low gear all day long. There was only one thing that could make him giggle, and that's if you got hurt. I remember I was filling silo with him one time, and we was hooking the blower up, and I stood up and I hit that downspout with my head. I just rang it like a church bell. And I remember weaving around, kind of trying to get my bearings, and I look over, and there's Jerry with his thumbs behind his overall straps, and he's just going, just about to bust, trying not to laugh. And finally he goes, "You gonna be all right?" And I said, "I think so." And he just fell apart laughing. But I got my revenge on him because, so Jerry, this was back when he had a herd of 35 gorgeous Holstein milk cows. And that's when this was still a pretty decent herd. And they were his pride and joy, as well they should have been. They were one of the finest herds in the county. And unfortunately, there came a day when his very best milk cow took ill. He had the vet out a couple of times. The cow continued to decline. And then came the day when not only was it evident that the cow was not going to recover, but she could no longer stand. And she was furthermore in pain, discomfort. And so he called my brother Jed, who also had cows and understood that this was very difficult. And he asked what you did in those days. He said, "Jed, can you come over, bring your deer rifle, and just put this poor cow out of her misery?" So my brother Jed comes over. He goes up in the manger with the rifle. He dispatches the cow. Well, now you got to get the dead cow out of the stanchion and out of the barn. So my brother backs a tractor up to the barn door, and he runs a cable from the back of the tractor to the cow, and he takes a hitch around the cow's one hind leg, and then he gets back on the tractor and very slowly, I mean, honestly, trying to be respectful, just very slowly starts drawing this cow out of the stanchion. Meanwhile, poor Jerry is standing there, thumbs again behind his overall straps, looking down, watching as his very best milk cow is being dragged lifeless from her stanchion. What Jerry doesn't notice is that the cable has pulled the cow's one hind leg this way. The other hind leg has got hung up in the stanchion, and it's being bent back like the arm on a catapult. And when the hoof cleared the stanchion, it whipped around and smashed him right in the kneecap. So he's now bouncing around on one leg, tears streaming down his face. My brother stops the tractor, says, "You gonna be all right?" And Jerry says, "I think so." And my brother says, "'Cause I got one more shell." So there I am, I'm at my desk. I got nothing for this column. I gotta finish it. And my brother John is calling me, and he's calling to tell me that his grinder exploded and basically shot him in the neck. Or as he said, "Yeah, got me right in the gozzel." I hadn't heard the term gozzel in years. It certainly never came up at nursing school. So I said, "Where are you calling me from?" And he said, "The parking lot at Farm and Fleet." And I said, "Well, what are you doing there?" And he said, "Oh, well, everybody always told me you should never fire up one of them grinders unless you're wearing a full frontal face mask." I'm pretty sure that's not what it says on the box. But he says, "Yeah, everyone always said you should never, ever fire up that grinder unless you're wearing a full frontal face mask. So I'm going to go in there and get me one of them because everyone always told me you should never do that. And I always thought that was kind of silly. But this has been a behavior-altering experience." So, of course, I'm just send. 45 minutes to spare. So. All right, thanks so much for coming. I'm going to close. I have one more collection called Peaceful Persistence, and I just want to close with the last piece in that collection, and it's the piece the title comes from. Thanks again for coming out. Lately, I've been leaning pretty heavily on The Healing Day, a song by Bill Fay. It's a gentle number, somewhere between lullaby and hymn. Fay was 69 years old when the song was released, and it's a good thing because it's a piece whose proper delivery requires some prior living. I've known some fine studio hands, and auto-tune is a wonder, but you can't chef up empathy. Fay sings as if he's smoothing a child's brow. It'll be okay, he sings, barely above his breath, his voice acknowledging the darkness all around, even as he breathes his belief in the light. I hear it and think of the times I've sat on the edge of my own child's mattress, doing my best to soothe the small creature when thin threads of dread hung above the bed. How many times do we hold our children close under the guise of comforting them, when in fact we're clinging to them as if they were the last buoy in a cold sea? The Healing Day lands on my ears as an unanswerable conundrum. The flat-footed, clear-eyed, wind-burned part of me knows no song so fragile, sung by a voice so frail, can withstand, let alone overcome, these hard-hearted days, or the vicious fools among us. You would do just as well to block a bulldozer by propping a blown glass ornament against the blade. And yet I accept the comfort of the song, because the comfort is real. It is ephemeral, but then in the big picture, so are bulldozers. Every battleground, sings Fay, is a place for sheep to graze. 9 words acknowledging the damage we humans do ourselves, conveying the implication that some of us will not survive or escape unscathed, but allowing that one day the blood and dirt will grow up in pasture. It's the perfect image. No animal grazes unless it feels safe. For 40 years, my dad raised sheep. Fay sings his song, and I see those sheep flocked and cropping grass in the mist. Last night in bed, I read a pair of Wendell Berry profiles. Berry's 85 and still working his dozen acres. Less than before, but then he's got plenty of labor banked. I found myself growing impatient with some of his insistences. Not because I think he's wrong, but because I don't see how enough of us can be Wendell Berry. Because I don't see how a couple tending 12 Kentucky acres is a credible bulwark against, let's go ahead and run the tracks off this metaphor, the bulldozer of consumer demand and simple venal greed. The disciples are outnumbered. But there was something in Berry's words that plucked a harmonic in my subconscious. It took me a bit, but after I snapped the bedside light off, it came to me. I was sensing the interplay between Berry's words and Bill Fay's music. Both men understand the battle is pitched against gentler folk, but peaceful persistence is its own reward. It isn't a matter of winning, it's a matter of dignity. Be at peace with yourself, sings Bill Fay in another song, and at the edge of sleep I recite those words against the universe, hoping my children will hear them. Thanks so much for coming tonight. Thanks. Thank you. I'll go out there. The biggest thank you I forgot. Thank you to the library, to all the volunteers, the folks behind the scenes who work to pull these things together. All I got to do is show up and tell stories about my brothers. So thank you so much.